Resident Evil 2 is probably one of my favorite horror games next to something like Dead Space. And it's one of those games that I've talked about when the discussion of the perfect remake comes up. This game just has such an amazing remake, and from the footage I've seen of the original game, it looks like the original was even better. And I wish I had the ability to play it, but I missed out on the opportunity when I had a functioning PlayStation 2. I could very easily talk about Resident Evil 2 from the original port, but I've never played it, so I really don't feel comfortable talking about a game and giving my opinion on something that I haven't personally played myself. Today, I will be talking about the history behind Resident Evil 2 and the remake, but I will mainly be focusing on Resident Evil 2's remake because that's the only version I've been able to get my hands on. And until Capcom decides to port it to the PS5, I will be stuck with just the remake, unfortunately. I know I could use an emulator, but I've tried, and my computer doesn't work well enough to run emulators. But just for a brief rundown on the game, Resident Evil 2 was originally released in 1998, before being remade in 2019 for the modern consoles. Now, the remake of this game was something that people had been asking for a long time. And I can't even begin to explain the amount of hype behind this game, because Resident Evil 2 has had such a huge cult following, even 20 years after its release. I'm going to try to be as accurate as possible with this, because there are a lot of notes that I've taken for this game, and I'm going to try to get it as right as possible. But let's get into the history behind both the original game and what led up to the game finally getting a remake. So where to start? Well, Resident Evil 2's development started 1 month after the release of Resident Evil in 1996, and this was worked on by a group of 45 people who would later become a part of Capcom Productions. And excuse me if I don't pronounce this correctly, but the team was led by Hideki Kamiya, and he was a designer for Resident Evil, and he would later become the director for Devil May Cry. The original producer in the early stages was Shinji Mikami, but because of multiple disagreements during the creative process, he stepped back into a purely overseeing role as producer, and demanded to be shown the build of the game at least once a month. Resident Evil 2 would take at least $1 million to create, which is a huge budget in comparison to the previous entry. So, Resident Evil 2 was originally going to be dubbed Resident Evil 1.5 by Mikami, and they actually showed off the demo with the title Resident Evil 1.5 at Jump V Festival Japan. This version of the game would drastically be different from the final product. In the demo build, the team wanted to ensure that they kept the same level of horror that the original game had, and they would end up introducing new characters that would change in the final product, but one character that remained basically the same was Leon Kennedy. Claire Redfield, who is the sister of Chris Boulder Punching Redfield, actually had a different name and design in the RE 1.5 demo. She was originally going to be named Elza Walker, who was a college student and a motorcycle racer who was visiting her hometown in Raccoon City. Unlike in the final version, the original build did not have Leon and Elza cross paths like they did in the final product, and they had their own cast of supporting characters. Leon would have Marvin, the police officer, and Linda, a research assistant, who would later be changed to Ada in the final product. Elza would be aided by Sherry Birkin and John, who would later be changed to Robert Kendo, the gun shop owner in the final product. Mikami revealed in 1996 that the sequel would have new monsters and more on-screen enemies to provide a more sensational horror, as the monsters would swarm the player on screen. So, the real-world influences for the characters would be shown through the artists, and I'm going to mess these names up, but Isayo Ohishi and Ryo Shimagama. They would base Leon on his Bloodhound, and the design of Annette Birkin would be based on Jodie Foster. The use of more zombies on screen was allowed because of the fewer use of polygons for the characters and for the items around you. They would end up scrapping Resident Evil 1.5 when it was around 80% done, because Mikami felt that the locations were too basic and it wouldn't reach the desired quality in time for the designated release date. This would be what would finally lead to the production of what would become Resident Evil 2. So, when Mikami started the production on Resident Evil 2, he had originally planned for this game to be the last game in the franchise. But Yoshiki Okamoto thought that it was too concise of an ending, and Okamoto believed that they could stretch the series out into a full franchise. During the pre-production, the team made no progress with rewriting the script. They eventually found a professional screenwriter named Noboru Sugimura, who is a popular screenwriter in Japan. Okamoto and Sugimura had a close friendship, and he was invited to work on the Resident Evil franchise. One of the fundamental changes that he made was to Elsa, who was changed to Claire Redfield in order to introduce a new tie-in with Resident Evil. Capcom wanted to sell 2 million copies of Resident Evil 2, and to try to hit that mark, they tried new things to introduce Resident Evil to new audiences. This was a Hollywood presentation. The developers wanted to restart the game from the ground up to fit these changes, and a few assets from Resident Evil 1.5 were repurposed with a better and more extravagant design, like as if it was from a Hollywood movie set. They created these designs using an SGI-02 computer, and many of the backgrounds would take weeks to render, and they limited the amount of zombies on screen to 7 at each time, so it would allow more polygons for the characters and for the environments. The character movement was created using stop-motion animations of action figures, and Ada's character model actually was the only one that was not finished in time, so they were not able to use her for any of the pre-rendered cutscenes. Resident Evil 2 would actually be delayed after the scrapping of Resident Evil 1.5, and many of the team members were sent off to go work on Resident Evil the Director's Cut. And when that was finished, they shipped a demo copy of Resident Evil 2 with that game as an apology for the delay of the sequel. God, remember when game production actually had passion and wasn't for the sake of just making money? Resident Evil 2 would release on PlayStation in 1998, with the game being ported to other consoles like PlayStation 2 and GameCube later on. But that was the development behind the original Resident Evil 2. Let's briefly talk about the development behind the remake, and then we'll get into the plot of the story. So, the remake for Resident Evil 2 was actually considered by Capcom back in 2002 when they released the remake of Resident Evil, but Shinji Mikami didn't want to divert attention away from Resident Evil 4, and this makes me kind of sad because I would have loved to have been able to play a remake of Resident Evil 2 the same way I did with the remake of Resident Evil, but I'm glad they decided to do a full-blown remake because I enjoyed it a lot. In 2015, Yoshiaki Hirobayashi announced in a video that a remake of Resident Evil 2 had been approved by Capcom, ending the video with the phrase, "We do it." I don't know if you guys know this, but there's an Easter egg in the game where you can actually find "We do it" in the game, so I don't know, just a little Easter egg there. After this, we really didn't hear much about the remake until Sony's E3 2018, where a trailer and gameplay footage would be shown, but without remake in the title. Actually, Hideki Kamiya, the game's director from the original Resident Evil 2, did an interview later on that he had pushed Capcom to do a remake multiple times before in the past, but for some reason it wasn't approved. Yoshiaki said that the team working on the remake was trying to recapture the spirit of the original game, and they incorporated feedback from Resident Evil 6, which was another game that he had produced. To meet modern expectations, the team had implemented some altered character designs, like removing Leon's shoulder pads to better match the more photorealistic environment. They also wanted to make it more catered to what audiences would want to play. So instead of focusing on over-the-top action, they really zeroed in on the horror elements. The game would also use the new RE engine, which was used recently for Resident Evil 7. The team actually acknowledged the difficulty of trying to make the zombies scary, as they had become very dumbed down by modern zombie franchises. They had tried to find a way to hide the zombies since they removed the fixed camera angles, which would normally allow the zombies to stay out of sight long enough to scare the player. They would eventually end up hiding the zombies through lighting, smoke, and the room layout of the map. This new camera style would also affect the sound design, as the sound could no longer come from a fixed source. And they would actually switch to the use of acousmatic sound, which is a sound produced without a visible source on screen. And this will normally create an anxious fear of something is coming for you. And this is used with Mr. X walking down the hall while you're in the safe room, or the sound of zombies banging on the door when you go into a new room. So I think that's really smart, and it worked out really well for them. Now, the change in gameplay and design also meant a change in character design. They made the characters really come to life by using face scans of real people, like the design for Leon was based on the model Eduard Baduluda, and Claire is based on the model Jordan McEwen. Now, due to Capcom using non-union voice actors, the original voice actors from the original Resident Evil 2 were not able to reprise their roles as the characters. That's really all of the information I could find regarding to Resident Evil 2's development, or at least Resident Evil 2 Remake's development. And honestly, you can tell that the team had a lot of care for making this game in the same spirit as the original. They really wanted to make it isolating and scary, and I think they did such an amazing job. The remake is considered to be one of the best Resident Evil remakes ever done, and as much as I like Resident Evil 4's remake, I still think Resident Evil 2's is way better because it's less action focused and more horror focused. I've played Resident Evil 4's remake countless times since its release, but nothing still scares me as much as Resident Evil 2's remake, especially when Mr. X comes into the picture. But now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's move on to the story of the game, and I'm going to focus more on Resident Evil 2's remake for the story rather than the original because I don't have footage of the original, so we're just going to stick with Resident Evil 2, the remake, sorry. So, the game starts off in Raccoon City, and depending on which character you start off with will depend on how your story will go, but I'm going to be talking about Leon first, and then I'll move on to Claire's story, because there are some major differences with the story. The game starts off as he's riding into town because he's starting his new job at the police department. He was told to stay away by Marvin, but he comes because he believes he will be able to help. He stops at a gas station on the outskirts of Raccoon City, and he finds a zombie eating one of the police officers inside of the station. And after witnessing this, he goes to run out of the station, and this is where he runs into Claire. They both escape the zombies by hopping in the police car, and they ride into town. This is where the credits start, and after the credits end, it shows Claire and Leon stopping the car on the street because the roadway is blocked. They both notice zombies start to surround the car, and they try to escape before an 18-wheeler crashes into the car. The 18-wheeler will eventually crash into the car, and the car will explode, and this will separate Claire and Leon. They both have their own stories, so they kind of take their own paths here. Leon discovers that he's been separated from Claire, so he plans on meeting her at the police station. When he arrives at the police station, he discovers that the whole station is empty, and once he looks on the computer, he notices a cop running and fighting for his life. Leon starts heading to link up with him, but once he gets there, the cop is ripped in half trying to escape through the shutter. Leon is then able to grab the police officer's notebook, which details a way out of the station through a secret passage. This will come in handy in a couple minutes, but Leon heads back as the zombie swarm is positioned, and he makes it back to the other shutter door and squeezes under it. As he tries to escape, he is grabbed by a zombie but is saved by Marvin, who crushes the zombie's head on the shutter. After this, Leon gets suited up in his iconic police uniform and tries to find a way to escape. He will eventually collect all of the medals and will have to leave Marvin behind to leave the police station. So, after taking the elevator down, Leon will find himself on underground the police station. After reaching a catwalk, he runs into a giant beast. This monster is William Birkin. He has injected himself with the G-Virus and has turned himself into a big bloated monster. After fighting the monster, Birkin will then turn and fall into the void. A ladder will fall and Leon will be able to climb up and escape. This will bring Leon to the parking garage of the police station, where he needs a key card. After examining the key card station, he will get attacked by a zombie dog, and will be saved by Ada Wong. This is the introduction to her character. She poses as an FBI agent trying to investigate the zombie outbreak. Ada says she's looking for her source, which has led her to the RCPD, and she tells Leon to leave and heads to the police lockup. Leon will follow her, and this is where we run into her source. His name is Ben. He is locked in a jail cell and he has the key card to get out of the parking garage. Leon questions why he's there, but before the source can explain, Mr. X busts through the wall and grabs the man by the face and kills him. Ada will then walk up afterwards and talk a little bit more about her quote-unquote investigation before walking away without explaining much more to Leon. This is where Leon needs to find 2 fuses. One is in the clock tower and one is in the dog kennel near the generator. He needs these fuses so he can turn on the power to open the jail cell and to get the key card. After you head back to the clock tower to get one of the fuses, Mr. X will lift up the helicopter and he'll chase you around the police station. After grabbing the fuse from the clock tower, Leon will then head back to the police lockup where he'll turn the power on and grab the key card. This sets off an alarm, and zombies will swarm Leon and so will Mr. X. He'll chase Leon out into the parking garage where he'll grab him and choke him. Ada will then slam into Mr. X with a truck, and then the truck will blow up, and Ada and Leon are both able to escape to the outside. After the two leave the police station, they will go to the gun store that's right across the street because they need a key to get into the alleyway. And this is where we run into Kendo, the owner of the gun store, whose daughter is infected. He threatens to shoot them, but his daughter interrupts and he gets very upset about the virus and leaves. They make their way to the sewer where Leon will be attacked by a giant infected reptile crocodile looking thing, and after blowing it up with the city's gas supply, he will escape. And then they continue on. Ada underground will eventually confront the scientist Annette Birkin, who will accidentally shoot Leon, who jumps in front of the bullet for Ada, and Annette is able to make her escape. This is where it switches over to Ada's perspective real quick. She is almost burned alive and crushed, and she will fall off a conveyor belt and gets impaled on a piece of scrap metal. This will switch back to Leon, who wakes up and finds Ada gone. He'll investigate through the sewers before finding Ada in a locked room that requires chess piece fuses. Once he opens the door, he is forced to fight an infected William Birkin again, who is defeated by a giant swinging crate. Leon will get to Ada, and the two of them will get to the cable car that brings them down to the nest, where all of the experiments with the virus took place. Once they arrive down at the nest, Ada will stay inside the cable car while Leon goes up ahead to find the G sample. And after exploring through the labs, Leon is finally able to collect all of the security chips so that he could get to the main part of the lab where the virus is being stored. Once he grabs it, the self-destruct sequence starts, and then Annette Birkin will find him on his way out to tell him not to trust Ada, because she is a mercenary looking to sell the virus. This is when William Birkin will pop up again, and you'll have to defeat him in another showdown. Annette will become severely wounded because William Birkin will crush her, so Leon will have to do this on his own. After popping all of the eyes and seemingly defeating William Birkin, Leon will escape and make his way back to Ada while the self-destruct sequence is turned on and starts destroying the lab. Once Leon gets outside to the main emergency exit, Ada will be there, and this is where Leon confronts Ada, who then holds him at gunpoint and asks for the virus. Ada realizes that she doesn't want to shoot Leon, and then Leon will be knocked down because of an explosion. The virus will fall into the abyss, and Ada will also fall before getting grabbed by Leon at a last-minute save attempt.
Ada tells Leon to let go and for him to save himself. She will let go on her own and then fall into the abyss, leaving Leon stunned as he snaps out of it and makes his escape. On his way out, Claire will contact Leon and tell him that she found a train that'll help them escape, and Leon rushes to get to the train. On his way, he'll run into Mr. X again, but in his final form, and after battling him for a little bit and doing some running and then battling him again, Ada will secretly drop down a RPG for Leon, who, he'll use it and kill the tyrant like they do in all the Resident Evil games. Leon is then able to make his escape. He jumps onto the train as it's about to leave the station to get out of the city, and if this is your first playthrough, that's where the game will end. Let me talk to you about Claire's playthrough briefly, and the secret ending you can get after playing through again on the second playthrough. So I'm just going to briefly talk about Claire's story. I'm not going to go into detail like I did with Leon. It's basically the same thing minus a few story beats. So it basically starts with Claire at the RCPD. She goes inside to look for her brother and finds out that Chris is not there. This will force her to have to open the secret entrance to escape and will bring her underground. While down there, she meets Sherry Birkin, who is the daughter of William and Annette Birkin. She is then attacked by William, and she defeats him. Sherry will follow you to the underground parking lot in the RCPD. This is where Sherry will be kidnapped by Chief Irons, who runs the RCPD, but she drops her necklace for Claire to pick up. The chief will then call Claire on his office phone and tell her to bring the necklace to the old orphanage. To get the key card, she needs to collect the fuses from the clock tower and from the storage room closet. Once she grabs those, she is able to grab the key card and gets out of the parking lot. While she's on her way out of the parking lot, this is where the tyrant will chase her out of the RCPD and follow you down the street. Finally, Claire gets to the orphanage. So while all of this was going on, Sherry was trying to escape the police chief, but she is stopped because the door is chained up. Right as Chief Irons is about to hurt Sherry, he is then infected by William Birkin. That he came out of an underground hatch, I guess. But after this, Claire arrives and follows Sherry underground, where they are chased by the tyrant and they get into an elevator. The tyrant is almost able to rip the cage open to grab them, but he is cut in half by the infected Birkin, who was able to take control long enough to protect his daughter, but he loses control and then jumps on the elevator, causing it to come crashing down. When Claire finally wakes up after being knocked out from the elevator crash, she meets Annette Birkin, and she finds out that Annette was married to William Birkin, or the giant monster that's been following her. And she eventually is able to find Sherry, but she has become infected by the G virus parasite. And she passes out in the same spot that Ada was in, which forces Claire to find the chest fuses to open it. Once Claire does this, she is able to fight Birkin again and defeats him with the same crate that Leon did, and gets angry that Annette doesn't do anything to save her daughter, so Claire will have to do this by herself. She picks up Sherry and brings her to the cable car to go down to the nest. So they finally get down to the nest, and Claire leaves Sherry in a side room while she goes to try to find the sample of the G virus. She uses the security chip bracelet that Sherry gave her, but she doesn't have the rest of the security chips, so she has to go around and collect those. Once she does this, she's able to go into the main lab, and she uses Sherry's necklace to get the sample. Annette will come out and actually try to stop William because William will bust through the ceiling. And after Annette is severely injured, Claire tells Annette to go save Sherry while she takes on the G-Virus Birkin. After this, Claire actually fights Birkin and defeats him. And when this is all over, she goes back up the elevator and heads back to go see how Sherry's doing. And when she walks in the room, she sees that Sherry is fully healed, but Annette is dying. Suddenly, the lab starts to go into self-destruct mode because the G-Virus sample has escaped the lab, or Leon and Ada took the sample. But Annette dies, and Claire and Sherry must escape. They use the main evacuation tube and they go down and they find a train, but it needs to be put together. Once Claire puts the train together, the giant blob version of William Birkin will come down and she will have to fight it. And eventually, after shooting enough bullets, the blob finally just pops like a giant zit, and you have to go into the train and take off before the lab explodes. After the train leaves, eventually you are joined by Leon, and the whole building is completely destroyed, and it looks like the game is finally over. Or is it? While you guys are on the train, you hear a giant thudding noise, and Claire goes and checks it out. Once she goes into the back cart, she sees that the giant blob version of Birkin is trying to hitch a ride with them. So Claire will have to once again beat Birkin's ass. Once she does this, Leon will disconnect the train cart, causing the train cart to go back into the fire, and it'll burn up the G-Virus Birkin. And they finally are able to escape. And so the game really wraps up with Leon, Claire, and Sherry walking down the highway as the trucker passes them and gives them the middle finger, and they walk off into the sunset. And that's pretty much how the whole story went for Resident Evil 2's remake. Now, there's a ton of differences with this game that I know if I don't mention them, or at least reference them in some way, I will get crucified in the comments section, but let's talk about some of the differences from the original game and the remake. The story beats are pretty much the same, besides for maybe a few boss fights. For example, the reveal of Mr. X is actually much different in comparison to the original. In the remake, Mr. X will stalk you through RCPD, but in the original, he only appeared in certain rooms. Also in the original, there's a lot more story that is told through diaries, and it explains what happens to the STAR members after the events of RE1. And obviously that's because, RE2 was the sequel of Resident Evil, and since this remake only started with Resident Evil 2 being remade, they didn't really mention a lot of what happened in the original Resident Evil game. I think the only thing I could really find that even referenced the first game was a couple of pages, and I feel like that was just more for the older fans. You know what I mean? They don't really go into that much detail in the remake. The original game explains Sherry's infection, saying that William Birkin did this to, spread the parasite with the G-Virus, and I might be mistaken, but I don't think that's mentioned at all in the remake. They also really don't mention a lot of Ada's backstory. In the original game, Ada's backstory was that, she was dating a guy named John who was a researcher for Umbrella. Her whole motivation in the original game was trying to find John, but he was killed by Umbrella. They also mention Ada using John to get information about Umbrella because she's a spy, and that John made her name as his password for his computer, which is a direct mention to Resident Evil. The story even starts to slowly build distrust between Ada and Leon in the original story, but for the remake, they have her identity as an FBI agent just go completely unquestioned until the end of the game. I love this game, don't get me wrong. The Resident Evil 2 remake is amazing, but I feel like by skipping over giving the original RE game the same kind of remake treatment, it forced developers to cut out a lot of the connection to the original story. And it was probably for new players so they didn't have to get caught up in order to enjoy the game, but I don't know. I didn't really notice this before, but it really kind of irks me now, because they did this with Resident Evil 3's remake, and that remake was a dumpster fire, and it made a ton of people unhappy. I still love this game regardless. I just feel like they missed out on an interesting story that would have been more faithful to the original game. But besides all of that, I want to get into the release of the game, and then we'll talk about should you play in 2024, and then I'll wrap up with my final thoughts. So, the original Resident Evil 2 released January of 1998 on the PlayStation, and it was ported to multiple different consoles, and it was praised because of its story, graphical improvement, and soundtrack, and just being an overall improvement of the original game. The game was promoted with $5 million, which is the equivalent to $9,300,000 in modern currency, and it became the fastest selling game in North America with 390,000 copies sold during the weekend of its release, and it grossed over $19 million, which is $36 million in modern currency, and it broke the sales records that was previously held by Final Fantasy VII and Super Mario 64. Over a month later, the game had sold 3 million copies worldwide, which is absolutely insane by 1998 standards. By August 1999, both Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 had sold over 11 million copies of each version of the game, and that included the copies of Resident Evil 2's DualShock version, and it made it the best-selling game to ever release on the PlayStation. Now, the sales for the remake is different because this is a more modern era, and we have to account for the downloads rather than physical copies. But Resident Evil 2's remake released January 28th, 2019, and prior to the release of the game, they would release some gameplay demos that would be the one-shot demo, which released January 11th, 2019, and it gave the player 30 minutes to play without any retry option. And another demo was the RPD demo that was re-released later, and this did allow for extra playthroughs for 30 minutes, but this demo had gotten 4.7 million downloads when it launched worldwide. When the full game was released, it sold 14 million copies worldwide, and it became Capcom's best-selling franchise, and it grossed over $840 million, which explains why they were so quick to follow it up with Resident Evil 3's remake. Those kind of numbers kind of blew me away. I don't know about you guys, but the numbers really put it in perspective as to why this game is as loved as it is. But that's all I really had to say about the release. Now I'm going to get into should you play this game in 2024. So first I'm going to start off with Resident Evil 2 1998. If you can get your hands on a ported version of this game, I highly recommend playing it. Even though I still haven't been able to play it, I'm currently trying to get an older console so I can play it. This game is just such an amazing follow-up to the original game, so of course it's worth playing in 2024, just so you can see where the remake originally came from, and plus, the original game just has so much detail that the remake doesn't. You know, if you're a hardcore Resident Evil fan and you want to get the full story and get all the story of what wasn't in Resident Evil Remake, then go for it. You know, it's definitely worth a shot. I went back and played the OG Resident Evil for my last video just so I could see what the game was like before the 2002 remake, and it made me enjoy the franchise so much more. As for the remake, it is widely available practically on every console now, so it can be played pretty much by everyone. Even if you haven't played the original and you just want to play it for the story to see how we got to Resident Evil in the franchise currently, it's definitely worth playing. It definitely isn't what Resident Evil 4 turned into with the emphasis on action and weapons over the horror element, but considering that the OG Resident Evil 4 had a fair amount of action, that really isn't that troubling. If you're looking for a heart-racing adventure, then the remake is definitely worth your time, and it's really affordable. I mean, the game is only like $10 right now, and you can get both Resident Evil 2 Remake and the Resident Evil 3 Remake, and the graphics still hold up really well. I mean, I shouldn't be shocked. It's only been 4 or 5 years since the release, so I wouldn't expect it not to hold up, but for the price and the puzzles, it's really worth your time. And I don't know, I'm a huge fan of this franchise. I haven't been a fan for a very long time, but in the time that I have been, I absolutely love this game. It's on my list of best horror games, so I highly recommend checking it out. But that's really it for that segment. Let's get into my final thoughts. So I know I had to change the format around for this video. That's because there's just a lot of history and story to both games, and I really wanted to cover that without turning this video into an hour-long video. And I absolutely love Resident Evil. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but the second game is just purely incredible in all of its forms. Many fans are divided over this game because the remake cut out a lot of content that the original game had, but the remake definitely got a ton of things right. And Resident Evil remakes usually end up cutting out some content along the way, and that will eventually get them into trouble with fans, especially with the people that loved Resident Evil Nemesis, but we'll talk about that in another video. Of course, the remake is not perfect. It does have some things that are criticized by OG fans of the franchise, but the game does a lot really well, and it's considered the high standard when it comes to remaking old games. I'm trying to be careful with my words so I don't have angry people in my comment section, but I'll just wrap this up. I absolutely enjoy Resident Evil 2's remake. I think it's a lot of fun and it's super scary at the same time. It's the perfect game to play if you're looking for the adrenaline rush of running from the tyrant. The zombies and the lickers also provide some heart-racing moments, and this game always satisfies that itch to feel scared. And Resident Evil is the franchise that I will continue to root for and love for years to come. And that's all I really have to say about this. And I don't know, man. If you want to go play it, man. I highly recommend it. That's going to do it for this video, though. I really want to thank everybody who's watching my videos. If you enjoyed this, please watch another video because that's how the algorithm works. And if you like this, maybe it'll recommend it to somebody else who does too. Also, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on future releases. And don't forget to comment what your thoughts are on the game, because I love hearing from you guys, and I really appreciate that you guys watch my videos because this has been something, this has been a dream of mine for so long, and I'm finally at a point where I can actually do this, and I'm having a ton of fun with it, and I just really want to thank you guys for watching. From the bottom of my heart, again, thank you guys for watching, and have a good night.